Please go out with me. Grandma, you little victim. What the fuck?
So I'm going to take this up a notch. I'm sorry. So I don't have the 100% full story of how my grandparents met because I did have some questions, but they were always a little bit cagey about it. But I do know why, and I'm about to share that with you. On a related note, I am talking about my maternal grandparents and not my paternal grandparents. That's another story I am not getting into on another time. Because yeah, the story I'm about to give you is a little bit more horrifying enough. So my grandfather was born in Southwest Alabama, a little bit further north from Mobile, which is my hometown, and my grandmother was born in Southeast Alabama, Butler County to be precise. The details that I don't know is basically how my grandparents were more aware of each other. I'm assuming it was maybe something kind of more like a church social or maybe some meet and greet. It was in the 50s. My grandparents married in 1956. But what I can tell you is that my grandfather was pretty much pressured to marry by his own parents. Basically, and he actually expressed this in the days that he was passing away, that his parents kind of pushed him to marry for his own good. Basically, they felt that he needed a wife. I think that was kind of the idea at the time for a lot of men or just a lot of young people in general, is that, and of course some conservatives think that today, like, hey, you need to go get married before you get yourself into trouble. You need a wife. And my grandfather kind of took that advice, so he looked for a wife. He found one on the Pool Plantation in Butler County, Alabama. You heard me right, plantation. My grandfather married my grandmother to get her off the plantation. Now, if you were to ask my grandfather why he picked my grandmother, or he decided to marry my grandmother, he would have told us, or he at least told me, that he was instructed to marry her in a dream. And the marriage did work out for them. They were married from 1956 until my grandmother died in 2017. That is 61 years. They were like the most amazing parents and grandparents you could ever imagine. And for two people who were born in like 1930s Alabama, they did very well for each other, especially since my grandfather, he only had a sixth grade education. And my grandmother didn't graduate high school either, but she knew how to read, but she could run that household. She was a queen at running the household. And my grandfather did make life comfortable for her. But let me get back to the plantation thing in case you want to know more about that. So my grandfather once just told me in passing just basically how this happened. So my grandmother, her family were sharecroppers for Mr. Poole, or the Poole family, in Butler County. And yes, I am naming them by name. I don't really care if they see this or not. They might owe us some reparations, so let's just do it with that. Um, let's okay, so the sharecropping situation is one of those situations where I think it has been whitewashed in history. Very recently, it has come out for a lot of people who have family from the South that the sharecropping situation wasn't really a sharecropping situation. It was basically chattel slavery by another name. And from all intents purposes, I think this is what happened with my grandmother and her family. In fact, while my grandfather was telling me this story, I said, "Oh, he cannot hold y'all. He couldn't hold them there. They weren't slaves." And my grandfather looked me in the eye and said, "Yes, sweetie, they were." So, my grandfather's kind of like me. I guess that's why we love each other so much. But yeah, he doesn't like being told what to do. So what happened was, he was courting my grandmother at the time. Like I said, I'm not sure how exactly they met, but he was actually going up to Butler County and was courting my grandmother. Did all the other things that more traditional people did, like talk to my great grandfather, who was, by the way, a very old man, kind of in that similar vein as the original Stitch. He was actually he was like almost in his 80s, if he wasn't in his 80s at the time. He lived to be 107. My grandmother, when they got married, was 21. My grandmother was also the baby, so it's pretty clear that my great grandfather tried to shelter her from that reality as much as possible. But she also didn't know anything and was basically, a country girl who was raised to be a good wife. So, anyways, my grandfather got into a little bit of trouble because he ran into Mr. Poole. And Mr. Poole told him that he did not want any Mobile Negroes, and I'm using Negroes because that's not the word he used, around his Negroes. Let me reiterate that. He did not want any Mobile ninjas around his ninjas. So my grandfather did the only logical thing. He grabbed my grandmother and ran to Mississippi and got married. They did make a pit stop on the way. They picked up my grandfather's mother as a witness, and then went to Lucedale, Mississippi, and got married at the courthouse. That happened January 7th, 1956. And of course, my grandmother never went back to Butler County. That's not the end of the story, though. What happened eventually, after the civil rights movement started to take off, a lot of people were starting to realize that they couldn't keep the system going. Like I said, you should really research a lot of people now saying that their folks were held in chattel slavery almost up until the 70s. That is also the case for our family. And basically what happened with my great grandparents, my grandmother's parents, and just everybody that was in Butler County, they eventually got evicted off of the land, and then they ended up resettling in Florida. My great grandfather, who again was an old man, he was born in 1870. He had died in 1977 in Florida. But yeah, he was held as a slave basically from birth, despite the fact he was born during Reconstruction. And my great grandmother was 25 years younger than he was because she was his second wife. But again, very horrifying story. None of these stories are very fun. Like I said, my grandfather married my grandmother to save her from bondage. Like, can you imagine? So also he made a promise to my great grandfather that he would never like beat or raise his voice at my grandmother. And if he were to do that, then to bring her back home. And you can kind of imagine what an ask that would be to bring her back home, back to the chattel slavery that she was accustomed to. So, yeah, they just stuck it out until my grandmother died in 2017, and then my grandfather died last year, and now they are buried together. So I can definitely speak upon that. I'm the oldest surviving grandchild. I'm the oldest surviving grandchild, and I lived with my grandparents part of my adult life. So even though it's really easy to look at their 61-year marriage and just kind of think, how beautiful of a love story it is, I do have a more realistic depiction of what that marriage looks like. I also don't want people to take away, because you can make a few narratives about the story of my grandparents. One of the things that is a narrative that you can say is that my grandfather saw my grandmother as this damsel in distress, who, this helpless damsel in distress, and he wanted to save her. And then also you could take away that, my grandfather basically found a woman who was already essentially a slave to become his wife. And both of those are false. First of all, I think it's important to say that they wouldn't have gotten married if my grandmother didn't want to get married. She was asked, and I quote, this is what she said, "Okay." Also, we need to address that a lot of this and the success in their marriage hinges on the fact that my grandfather needed to be a decent human being and not abuse his gender role in the 1950s. Like I said in the original video, my grandfather he promised my great grandfather that he would never mistreat my grandmother. And for the most part, he kept that promise. But not only did he keep that promise, he also never spanked his children or grandchildren. Now, they weren't permissive parents by any means, but they were very loving, doting parents. But here's the thing about a quote unquote traditional marriage. Now, I can assume that my grandparents probably had some type of intimacy at some level. I mean, they did have 6 children after all. But the marriage wasn't meant for them. It was meant for the children. And that is how they framed their marriage. In fact, I think it was best to say that their marriage was treated almost like a business. A lot of their affection that they had was geared more towards us. I personally didn't see a lot of personal displays of affection among my grandparents. I would see them hold hands. My grandfather would escort my grandmother to places. He had pet names for her. But like, as far as like, the big intimacy stuff, I never really did see that. And it might have just been a product of them being raised the way that they were. With that traditional marriage, some sacrifices had to be made. Like, for instance, my grandfather used to play baseball. My grandparents were 21 and 23 when they got married. My grandmother was 21 and my grandfather was 23 years old. And my grandfather had dreams to play Major League Baseball. And of course, when he got married and started a family, he had to switch gears. In turn, my grandmother basically came from a background that was already horrifying enough, but she was also the youngest child in that background. And then she went to run a household at 21 years old. And she did a phenomenal job. My grandmother she was a whiz at numbers, and we didn't even realize to the extent until she died. She kept every single bill that they ever had. She kept every single bank statement and was, tallying money up to the penny. So she was really, really, really good at numbers. But of course, she didn't have any of the opportunities to pursue anything beyond being a housewife. So I think it goes without saying, this was not the path that they wanted for their own children and grandchildren. My grandparents had 4 daughters. All 4 of them got a job and work and make their own money. And then, of course, they have 3 granddaughters, me and my 2 cousins. And one of them is graduating high school, so she doesn't really have a job right now, but the same thing. And it was instilled in us very early to not be dependent on any man, and to make sure that we got our education and that we were as independent as possible. I do feel the need to say there's some other things in a traditional marriage that I don't think a lot of people would either agree with or just cannot deal with today. I know some of the discourse about, people talking about submitting and fixing plates. Okay, first of all, my grandmother did not fix plates. Now, she loved to cook. She really did. But let me just tell you one of the fun things that they used to do. So part of that traditional marriage, for instance, is involving the larger family into the unit. I don't think a lot of people realize this who advocate for traditional marriage, especially if you're one of those people who are really hinging on the nuclear family. That didn't exist in our family. So basically, my grandmother made friends with her in-laws, and particularly the wives of my grandfather's brothers. All her nieces and nephews, everybody, she kept up with everyone, knew everyone by name. My grandfather did too. This was very normal for them. Also, my grandfather would say, I may be the king of my castle, but your grandma is the boss. Meaning, whatever she said goes. Everything in the single household, anything that was going on with the day-to-day of the household was the final decision of my grandmother. She was not submissive by any terms. That was her house. She might have been a little soft-spoken, but no, she was never of that quote-unquote submissive type. When you're in a traditional marriage, such as my grandparents, you might have to agree to certain things. Like, for instance, my grandfather built my grandmother. He literally built her house. Also, he signed his paycheck over to her 100%. In fact, there's a funny story. My grandfather once tried to go to the bank sometime in the 70s or whatever, and he couldn't withdraw his own money because the bank person didn't recognize him as the person on one of the accounts because my grandmother did the banking. And so he had to get permission from my grandmother to withdraw money out of their own account. So my grandfather worked 32 years at a job that was very grueling and very taxing. And at the end of the day, he didn't have access to his money. He gave his check straight to his wife and got an allowance from her. So my grandparents definitely had that mantra that his money was hers. And if she had a job, her money was also hers. My grandmother didn't spend a lot of money though, which is something that again is part of their traditional marriage. So your marriage, their happiness came second. And that was just kind of the way things were, how they saw it. So they didn't really go on any big vacations or anything like that. They didn't make any large splurges. They were basically saving up for our inheritance and making sure that we were taken care of after their deaths. And then, of course, anything that we needed, they reached into their pockets to help us out. My grandfather, well, both my grandparents, but they wrote a check for my first car that I ended up crashing 6 months later. But they helped me purchase that car. But like I said, a lot of the attitudes that my grandparents would have had kind of hinge a lot on the man doing what he needed to do. So this was something that my grandparents didn't want us to depend on. And so we were raised not to. My grandfather also liked getting tasks and he liked being useful. And then of course he used to thank my grandmother a lot and he used to thank us a lot. So he was very fortunate and very grateful for his wife. They definitely, they definitely lucked, I don't want to say lucked out, but, my grandfather really believed that that was the woman he was supposed to marry. And he wanted to make sure that everything went the way it should have been. And my grandparents did enjoy some luxuries. My grandmother really liked nice clothes and she liked jewelry and she did get her hair done every week. So they didn't, save absolutely everything. They did have little splurges and my grandfather had like a CB radio hobby and a little tinkering hobby that he loved. But yeah, for the most part, everything was for us. They wanted to make sure we were taken care of because that was the type of people that they were. Also, my grandfather was raised with some Choctaw values, which means, Choctaw society is matriarchal. So he wanted to make sure that we always greeted my grandmother first. We always hugged her first. And when she died, she got the bigger funeral.